share that with us. And without any further ado, here's Chris Jordan.
Thank you, Christopher. Well, it's so good to be here. And I'm glad I came yesterday so I could just kind of hang out a little bit and begin to feel the vibe of this conference and this group, because it's a different vibe than I've ever felt before. I've never been to a student-run environmental conference before, and there's just something about it that's like got my heart in my throat the whole time. We were walking outside a little bit earlier, and spring is on its way, and it's arriving, and the cherry blossoms there's this one tree that's just like, no, with all the cherry blossoms. And like that's what the vibe of this group feels like too. It's like there's something really pure and beautiful, and it's a privilege and an honor to be here and share my work with you. There's only one piece of this conference that bothers me a little, and it's something about the whole sustainability movement that just like grates on me, and that's the word sustainability. It's like, God, don't we aspire to so much more than merely sustainability? I've been looking for the last 10 years of my work, I've been looking kind of deeply into the world of activism and trying to figure out like how do we reach a much, much larger audience? How do we transform the world at the speed that we know it needs to be transformed? At the speed with the level of decisiveness that our scientists are all uniformly telling us we have to act. And so what I want to do is I have some older work that sort of leads up to my work on Midway Island, but I want to get through that as fast as possible because I want to really take you on a deeper journey to Midway, and then also have some time to hang out and just take questions and stuff like that. So let's just dive right in. Just take a second to get technically organized here. Yes. So I am a photographer or a photographic artist, and for a long time I took photographs of giant piles of garbage. That was sort of my beginning, my first stepping my toes into the waters of being an engaged citizen and an artist who's interested in saying something about what's happening to our world. And so I got on this roll photographing giant piles of our waste. And what I thought I was doing all that time, like the Port of Seattle is really kind of obviously visible from everywhere in Seattle. That's where I live. And so you kind of can't help but see the massive infrastructure of our mass consumption, because right there on Seattle's waterfront, these huge ships are arriving, and you see all these containers of our stuff getting unloaded and onto trains and trucks, and so there's just always this movement of so much stuff. And so I started going down into the Port of Seattle and making these photographs, and also later on visiting recycling facilities and landfills and places like that, and making these photographs of that attempted to begin to face the enormity of our mass consumption. And hey guys, I'm noticing a little bright spot right here. Any chance you could pull that the spotlight just, yes. Just to not distract. And so, like this, for example, I took this photograph at a cell phone recycling facility in Atlanta. I looked all over the country to find a place where I could find the most possible amount of cell phones at one place at one time that I could take a picture of. And this is the most cell phones I could get myself in front of, which is about 3,000 phones. This is one day of this facility's processing of cell phones. And the intention is to face the enormity of our mass consumption. So I composed this picture to try to evoke that. I made a swirl of phones to try to evoke the enormity, like the feeling of the galaxy, kind of gravity. And yet, at the same time as I was doing this work, I was reading about mass consumption, And for example, the statistic about our cell phone consumption for the year that I took this picture was we used 130 million cell phones. We discarded 130 million phones that year. And this is just a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket of that many phones. And I had this craving as a photographer. It's like, I'll go anywhere to photograph the whole Mount Everest of our phones. Or, you know, and of course there is no such place. But I was willing to go anywhere, and I had this craving as a photographer. Like, images are so powerful, and we can see the full cumulative mass of our mass consumption. Like, where's the Grand Canyon of our garbage, where it all goes? And if we could actually see that, you know, if there was, imagine if there was one place where all of our plastic bottles went. 210 billion plastic bottles consumed in the United States last year. If there was one place where all of our plastic bottles went, it would be a mountain. It would be a mountain as big as Mount Everest. And if we had to go there and stand in front of it, and then throw our own bottles on there, then it would be kind of a life-changing experience, because we get to behold the enormity of our consumption of that one particular item with our senses. But there is no such place. You know, all of our waste streams, all of our consumption is divided up into millions of different streams, and there's nowhere you can go and see these cumulative kind of disasters, the multi-scale, multi-level disasters that we have going on all over the world in so many different ways. And the hardest of all of them, of course, is our carbon emission. You know, people are saying that's the most important issue facing our time right now. 30 gigatons of carbon, that's the number. 30 gigatons last year. 30 billion tons of an invisible gas. And each ton being 2,000 pounds. So that's 60 trillion pounds of an invisible gas. Like, it's so hard to comprehend that. It's far beyond our ability to comprehend. And sociologists do these really interesting studies that show that the human mind can't comprehend numbers more than a few hundred or a few thousand. And in fact, there's even a radical difference between the way we comprehend the number 1 versus the number 2. So if you take a group like this, and you say, how much of your income, and you show them a picture of one starving child, you say, how much of your income would you give to save this one starving child? Then the average number is like $50. And you say, okay, thank you all. You bring in another group, same size, same demographic, etc., and you show them a picture of 2 starving children, and you say, how much of your income would you give to save these 2 starving children? And the number drops way down to like $5. And if you say, okay, thank you all, you bring in another similar group, and you show them a picture of like 18 starving children, and you say, how much would you give? The number drops to 0 consistently. And so, like, we think in terms of family numbers. Like, that's how our minds are programmed. Tribal numbers. We might be able to comprehend a few hundred or a few thousand. But hundreds of billions, you know, millions, or now numbers in the trillions, are far, like, magnitudes beyond our ability to make any sense of. And yet, that's the only information we have to comprehend and feel something about these profoundly important issues that are facing our world. Whether it's the amount of carbon being released, or the number of trees being cut to make the paper for junk mail, or the number of people, 925 million people in the world right now, who are starving or suffering from malnutrition. Like, every day we talk to each other in these huge numbers, and we read these numbers as if we understand them. And on a sort of emotional level, intellectual level, what actually happens is these numbers, my experience is, they don't go in one ear and out the other. They just go in one ear and bounce right back out the same ear. Like, nothing happens reading those gigantic numbers. And so I think that's part of the disconnect that we have with these issues, and why it's so hard to both individually and collectively begin to act radically, as our scientists are telling us that we need to. The way Al Gore put it, a few years back, I heard him speak, and he said something that I thought was really profound. He said, we all know what we should be doing, but we aren't finding the collective will to do it. And I got really interested in that gap. Like, why is that gap there? What's the disconnect? And I think we only act decisively or passionately when we feel something. You know, if we feel angry enough, or if we feel rageful enough about what we can't control, if we feel frightened enough about our future and the future of our children, or if we feel sad enough about what's being lost every day, then when we feel something, that's when we act. And most powerfully of all, most powerful motivating feeling by far is love. When we fall in love, then we're willing to do crazy stuff. Oh yeah, I'll move to your country and learn to speak your language, and you know, like when we fall in love, it's like, yeah, I'll totally change my life. And when all we have to relate to the loss of the sea turtles, the diminishing populations of bluefin tuna, the loss of our tigers, you know, when all we have is maybe a couple photographs of individual ones and a statistic in the billions, and here's how many have been killed. Here's 100 million trees a year in the United States cut to make the paper for junk mail. It's like, it just doesn't register. And I want so much to bridge that gap. I think it's so important for the healing of our world, for us to begin to comprehend what is happening out there. And then, once we begin to comprehend it, then we have a much bigger issue, and that is to deal with the feelings, to hold the feelings that come up. And that's what my Midway project is about, that I want to get to. So I photographed for a few years, making these images, and always wanted to figure out a way to actually get in front of the true enormity of our mass consumption. And that led me into a body of work of conceptual images that I created that I call Running the Numbers. And there's lots on my website, and it's a traveling exhibition, and there's a book and stuff if you're interested in seeing more of these. But basically what I did is I stitched together thousands of photographs of smaller quantities of things to actually illustrate statistics about our mass consumption. So here's an example of one of them. I took lots and lots of photographs of plastic bottles. So this is already maybe 50 or 100 photographs. I only had this many plastic bottles. And so what I did was I just put them on the ground, and I took a picture of them, and then I stirred them and took another picture. So I can take those two pictures, and in Photoshop I can join them together and stitch out the edge between. So now I have a picture that's twice as many megapixels and that has twice as many bottles. And if I just keep track of how many of those I'm stitching, I can start to build a gigantic image. And this is 2 million plastic bottles, which is 5 minutes of our plastic bottle consumption in the US. And that's 24/7, 365. This is taken from the yearly statistic. That's 8 football fields covered with plastic bottles. And it's kind of weird when you see it. It's like I get a lot of hate mail from people saying, oh, these numbers are so obviously exaggerated, showing your liberal bias. And I don't think the New York Times gets that kind of mail when they write an article that says, last year in the United States we used 210 billion plastic bottles. That's just an illustration. It's like 210 billion, it doesn't register. But that's the same number, just as a photograph and reduced down to 5 minutes of our plastic bottles. It's like when we can see it, then something visceral starts to happen. And I get a lot of that pushback myself. I consider it to be an indication that it's working. So whenever I get that kind of mail, I'm always happy. So here's another one I made about the Pacific garbage patch, and I'm just going to dive right into the Pacific Ocean, so to speak. So I learned about this phenomenon, the Pacific garbage patch, that you guys have probably all heard of. And the first thing I learned was the public misconception was that there's a floating island of garbage in the Pacific Ocean that's twice the size of Texas. And the citizen part of me, when I first heard that, was like, oh my God, what an incredible tragedy. And the photographer part of me was like, oh, I'm the guy that takes photographs of giant piles of garbage. I can go to the middle of this place and climb to the top of the mast of a boat and make a panoramic horizon-to-horizon image of garbage that will blow people's minds. And so I went to a meeting of a bunch of ocean scientists who study ocean currents and ocean plastic. And my intention was to try to bum a ride on somebody's research vessel to the middle of the Pacific garbage patch. And to my chagrin, it happened again. I learned that this issue is invisible. That if you take a boat to the middle of the Pacific garbage patch, which I now have, all you see is the wide open blue Pacific Ocean. And you might see a tire floating 100 yards away, and you might see a plastic bottle cap drifting by, but it doesn't all collect in one place. It doesn't all sort of swirl to the middle the way people think. It tends to float underwater. It doesn't bob right on the surface like a cork. Plastic bags, they might be 60 feet down or 10 feet down, and a plastic bottle that's filled with water would be below the surface. And they also break down into smaller and smaller pieces. And the individual pieces never, once they get down to individual plastic molecules, scientists say they will never break down. They will always be plastic molecules, but the things that hold the molecules together break down, and pretty soon a plastic bag is hundreds of billions or trillions of individual molecules of plastic that are in the water that are invisible. So the Pacific garbage patch, like the carbon in our atmosphere, is invisible, and as a photographer, I'm like, God, I want to take a photograph of the Pacific garbage patch. And this, a marine scientist said, well, at least you can borrow a whole bunch of plastic that I have, that I collected from the Pacific Ocean, and that I have a big bin of it in my lab. So he sent me the bin of plastic, and here it is. Lots of different colors of plastic, and that one in the middle you can see has been chewed on by fish. Those are fish tooth marks. Here's another little close-up section of this very large conceptual artwork that I made. And so we're going to slowly zoom back. You can see all the pieces of plastic. Zooming back further and further. And finally we get all the way back, and there's the Great Wave off Kanagawa. It's a famous work of Japanese art by an amazing Japanese artist named Hokusai. And that's made out of 2.4 million pieces of plastic, which is the estimated number of pounds of plastic that enter the world's oceans every hour. And Hokusai's piece is a very clever yin-yang symbol. You can see that the wave and then the negative space of the wave create a yin-yang symbol. And Hokusai, he was interested in raising two different yin-yang relationships. The stillness of the land and then the tremendous moving power of the ocean. So you can see Mount Fuji there, that's the stillness of the land, and then to the left there's a wave that's sort of halfway. It sort of looks like Mount Fuji, but it also looks like an ocean wave, and then there's the great tidal wave coming. So it's those things in yin-yang relationship, and then also the great power of the oceans and the fragility of man. So here, it's a little vague to see, but these are boatmen